French and Indian War had a major impact on the American Revolution. So let's talk a little bit about French and Indians in 1754. Who are the Native Americans who were involved in this war, and why is it called this? Well, those are some of the things that we're going to talk about, and I'm constantly throughout these next few videos, I'm going to talk about the French and Indian War, but you should know that it's also called the 7 Years' War when you talk about it on a global scale. But in America, the war lasted 9 years, and when we say French and Indian War, we generally mean the war that took place in the American colonies. So I'm going to start with some political background. By the mid-1730s, the French were doing very well in the colonies and were quickly becoming very wealthy and powerful. And a lot of this had to do with the possession of some West Indies islands and their high sugar production. So they started to build forts in Louisbourg, and they become a presence in colonial America. And here you can see how much the French had a presence in America, and how if you were an American colonist and an English American colonist looking at a map like this, you might get a little bit concerned about how much the French were sort of surrounding the American colonies, and how much their presence could threaten an American presence, especially as they moved down towards Louisbourg. And you can see Louisbourg in the sort of top right hand screen just below Newfoundland. And so Louisbourg is French, but it's in between this territory that has recently become English. So this is of high concern, especially for people who are in New England. Now, England hopes to counteract France, which has been their long-term enemy, by picking fights with Spain. France is just too powerful. They're looking at this map. France is powerful in the American colonies. They're powerful in other places. But Spain is big, it's lazy, and it's perfect to take down. They've been way too wealthy, and so they've gotten a little bit too big and a little bit too, what we call corrupt. And so the ensuing war is called the War of Jenkins' Ear. Robert Jenkins was a smuggler who lost his ear to the Spanish Navy, and the British Parliament sends out an order to seize Spanish ships in retaliation. And this War of Jenkins' Ear is really sort of a historical side note for the American colonies. Now, most of the war took place in the Caribbean, and the Spanish won. Now, the American colonists did contribute some sailors towards the British effort, and the British saw the Americans as sort of bunglers and cowards, not able to fight very well, and the American colonists saw the British as sort of incompetent leaders. And so this war in 1739 really starts to cement the British and American antagonism towards each other, where they just see each other as not allies, but sort of unfortunate bedfellows. Now, France and England go back to war against each other in 1744, but that's back in Europe. And during this time, there are some border skirmishes in New England. Indian Native American allies attack some settlements in the colonies. Now, the colonists end up in this war in 1744 staging a raid on the fort at Louisbourg. And so here is an image of that raid and the fort at Louisbourg, which is sort of in Nova Scotia. And so they were aided by the British Navy, but 4,000 colonists, mostly from New England, sieged the fort in 1745. And this is a huge point of pride for the colonists. They're able to do this on their own. They're able to invade Canada. It's the only time that Americans have ever invaded Canada and succeeded. Now, at the end of the war in 1748, the British returned the fort to the French in those peace negotiations, and the Americans were furious with this. And the Americans resolved never to sort of give any more land, let the British take any land from them again, even though they are technically British. They see this as a real disservice to what they've done. Now, in By 1754, along with the French, the Spanish, and the English, the Native Americans are a powerful force in this part of the world. So here's an English trader in 1755. He says, "The importance of the Indians is now generally known and understood. A doubt remains not that the prosperity of our colonies on the continent will stand or fall with our interest and favor among them. While they are our friends, they are the cheapest and strongest barrier for the protection of our settlements. When enemies, they are capable of ravaging in their method of war, in spite of all we can do to render those possessions almost useless." And what this trader is recognizing is that the Native Americans are the go-between between the French and the Spanish. And I'll show you a map here in a second. It's a little bit hard to see here, but if you can imagine, on the right-hand side is the English settlements. And then on the other side of Lake Ontario is the French and some of the French settlements. And so this part where you have what is the Iroquois nations, and I'll talk about them in a second, is what we call a middle ground. And it's this area that's in between the English and the French. And so the French need those Native Americans as a barrier against the English, and the English need those Native Americans as a barrier against the French. And so the Native Americans in this middle have this wonderful negotiating power where they can go to the English and say, "Oh, you want us to be your allies? Well, could you trade us? We want so many guns and we want to only pay this amount." And the English say, "Oh, I don't know." And they say, "Well, the French, they're willing to pay less." And so the English say, "Okay." And then the same Native Americans could then go to the French and say, "Oh, well, the English are willing to, give us these guns for this amount of money. What are you willing to pay? You want us to be your allies?" And so the Native Americans in this middle ground do a really good job of negotiating the English and the French against each other. You can see the Iroquois Six Nations, who end up siding with the English during the French Canadian War, the only groups to do so. And here they are, the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, the Seneca, and the Wenro. They make up the Iroquois Six Nations, and they end up siding with the English. But most Native Americans, in fact all the rest of the Native Americans in this region, the Huron, for instance, they end up siding with the French. And that's one of the misnomers about the French-Indian War, that it's the French and the Indians against the English. It's not, right? There are some English with some Native Americans, the Iroquois, and there's some French with Native Americans, and they're all fighting each other. So this becomes a war between Native Americans as well as between the English and the French. So as the English start expanding, the Native Americans, for the most part, see the English as a threat, right? The French are much more willing to be kind to Native Americans. The English, not so much. Very few Native Americans ever do very well among the English. The French are they're not as many of them, they're less threatening, they tend to be nicer. Their goods aren't as cheap, but they are, they're not as good quality, or they're not as cheap, but they're just a lot more reliant. And so Native Americans have to make a choice, which side they want to do. The war is one of those deciding points where this is sort of the last time Native Americans really get to play the two sides off of each other.